Well, let's turn our attention back to the race for number 10 now. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak is promising more handouts to help people get through the cost of living crisis if he wins the Tory leadership contest. He says he'll offer support to everyone, with particular focus on pensioners and the most vulnerable. Well, let's find out a little bit more now, shall we? I'm joined by the Conservative MP and supporter of Rishi Sunak, Dr Liam Fox. Very good morning to you.
Again.
Good to see you. Rishi Sunak has written in the Times about this, hasn't he, today, setting out his latest plans to tackle these cost of living pressures. Let me just read out one extract of that to you. He says, if it requires some limited and temporary one-off borrowing as a last resort to get us through this winter, I'm prepared to do that. He's opening the door to borrowing, isn't he? I mean, isn't that a U-turn after all he's said about Liz Truss's plans?
Well, you have to have read the paragraphs before that, not just that one, which says that this is an absolute last resort, not a first resort. The key thing is that global energy prices are remaining very high. And that's a result of the fact that global production has not caught up with global demand, because people who did the maintenance and the production, they suffered from COVID too. The people transporting the oil by sea, they had COVID too. So there's an ongoing disruption in the global economy. The question is are we going to protect the most vulnerable during that period? This is not a shift in policy towards borrowing, in the way that I think Liz Truss's policy, which was to borrow to cut taxes, is a long-term shift. This is a response to a specific problem, and I think it shows that he fully understands what the most vulnerable in our society will be facing.
And yet he has spent weeks trashing Liz Truss's borrowing plans, hasn't he? Saying that it's immoral to pass the burden on to the next generation. So he's undermining his own argument.
Not at all. I've just explained why. Because what she's saying is, let's borrow money to cut taxes in the hope that it will stimulate demand further. Well, the problem at the moment is demand is already outstripping supply, which is why we've got inflation. What he's saying is, let's try, first of all, we've got the windfall tax on the energy companies. Then let's look at public spending projects to see if we can save that money so that we can ensure that the help is available to the vulnerable only in a very last resort. And for a one-off reason would we want to see further borrowing. So there's quite a big difference.
OK, and so let's look at what he is preparing to offer. He's talking about £10 billion worth of help, but £5 billion of that is the VAT plan that he's already announced on energy bill. So are we talking about £5 billion of new money? And if so, is that enough?
Well, it's £10 billion of new help. What he said is that...
But some of it has already been announced.
Some of it's been announced, but it's not been spent, and it's not the money's not yet available in that sense. So what it says is that, yes, we understand, Rishi understands, that there is a need to help people further, as long as this energy price emergency continues. Eventually, of course, prices are likely to fall as global supply comes back up to the levels that we had before, but there's going to be a period where help will be required, and it's responsible, socially responsible, to ensure that that help is available.
And how far will that £5 billion of newly announced money, how far will that go? The consumer champion Martin Lewis has talked about the need to double the amount of support that's available. I mean, the last lot of new support was worth about £15 billion. So this isn't going to go far enough.
Well, that support, some of that support, of course, is still coming through the pipeline. Another £10 billion would be a huge help on that. But as Rishi said, we have to wait to see what the cap looks like before we can calculate exact costs. But it's right to say, in principle, that those who need help, those who are watching your programme, who are afraid that they won't be able to heat their homes through the winter, have the reassurance that a government led by Rishi Sunak would be on their side.
And how soon will that help come, and who will get it?
Well, it will depend, again, on the size of what the cap is, and it will be targeted largely at those who are most in need. Pensioners, for example, those on fixed incomes, those for whom a cut in tax wouldn't actually help them at all. It's going to have to be targeted at those most in need, because these are the people who may simply not heat their homes, may be unable to meet some of their bills. They're the ones who are going to require the biggest help. They're the ones who can't raise their income.
Well, yes, and targeted help for the vulnerable, they will say that's what we need. Others will say, why go for a rebate for all, like is currently was in his plans as Chancellor, the £400? Was that the wrong approach?
Well, it's targeted, isn't it? There's a rebate for everybody, and then there's extra help. So that ranges from £400 per household to £1,200 if you're in the most vulnerable groups. I think that's the right way to do it. And I think that the tax on the energy companies, which is, as you can imagine, as a free market here, I wouldn't normally support, but I think that windfall taxes should only be on windfall profits. And if the companies are making unusually large profits because of the very high global prices as a result of the pandemic, it's fair that the government cushions that blow to consumers.
And what about for anyone on benefits, for pensioners watching, for those on lower incomes? Can Rishi Sunak guarantee that they will not fall short when the October price cap is announced?
Well, the aim will be to protect those people.
Will they be able to? Can they think I don't need to find more money from anywhere?
I can't tell you that because I don't know what the cap is going to be this morning, but the aim is very clear. The aim from Rishi Sunak is to say, we understand that we can't simply say we'll cut taxes because that won't help those who are actually at the bottom end, who are not paying taxes or on fixed incomes. They're the ones who have got to get the biggest amount of help. As you correctly say, at the moment we're giving help to all households, but extra help to those in most need. That seems to me both economically and morally the best way forward.
Is it problematic for Rishi Sunak that he's been Chancellor until a few weeks ago, and today we get figures showing that our growth is contracting in this country? Does that reflect on him and his management of the economy?
No, no more than it does the fact the American economy has contracted for 2 quarters in a row. This is a global problem. Pandemics don't just stop in their effects when the health position gets better. There are long-term economic ripples that come out from pandemic, which is why we're seeing that around the world. And I think that what it does show is that we need to have a very clear grasp of the problems we face. Number one being inflation, that we must get control of. And the second is that we must gear our economy up by investment to grow in the future. And that's a responsible plan. We know that the rise in prices isn't just an economic problem, it is actually a social and a moral problem too, which is why it's got to be the number one priority for the next Prime Minister.
And I'm going to let you go in just a moment, but a very quick question. Last night, Rishi Sunak said that Boris Johnson wasn't returning his text messages or calls. Does that bother him?
I wouldn't know whether that bothers him. I don't think it's all that surprising, is it, to most of us? I imagine that Boris Johnson is planning other things and may have less time for the immediate politics around the leadership election. So, no, surprised? Not really.
OK, Liam Fox, thanks very much indeed for coming in.